The autumn wind swept across the Montana grasslands, carrying with it the kind of cold that cut through layers of fabric and settled deep in the bones. Marcus Whitmore had been riding since dawn, checking fence lines on the far eastern section of his sprawling ranch, when he spotted something that didn't belong among the golden prairie grass and scattered sage. A wagon, overturned on its side, one wheel still slowly spinning as though the accident had happened only minutes before. His first instinct was to ride past. This section of land bordered the reservation, and Marcus had long ago learned that some tragedies weren't his to solve, but something made him slow his horse. The body lay 10 feet from the wagon, partially obscured by tall grass. A woman. Marcus could see that much. Dark hair matted with blood, one arm outstretched as though reaching for something just beyond grasp. He dismounted, moving closer with the reluctance of someone who'd seen enough death to recognize its permanence. She'd been thrown from the wagon, probably when it tipped. The angle of her neck suggested the fall had been fatal, or close enough that survival was never a real possibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus turned away, preparing to report this to the territorial sheriff in Millbrook, when a sound stopped him. Not the wind. Something else. A child's voice, thin and frightened, coming from inside the overturned wagon. Marcus's chest tightened. He approached the wreckage and peered into the dark interior, his eyes adjusting slowly to the shadows. 2 small figures huddled against the far side of the wagon's interior, pressed together like animals seeking warmth. Twin girls, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with identical tear-stained faces and eyes wide with terror. "Come out," Marcus called, keeping his voice steady and low, the way he spoke to spooked horses. "It's safe. Come out of there." The girls didn't move. They clutched each other tighter, and Marcus saw that the younger-looking one was sobbing silently, her whole body shaking. The other girl, marginally older by perhaps minutes, put a protective arm across her sister's shoulders and shook her head firmly. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice hoarse from crying, but fierce with determination. "Not until Mama wakes up." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some protective instinct he'd thought long dead stirring back to life. He understood then that this tragedy was far more complicated than a simple accident. These children didn't yet understand that their mother was gone. And Marcus Whitmore, who'd spent the last decade running his ranch with ruthless efficiency and emotional distance, was about to step into a situation that would demand both his strength and his capacity for compassion, neither of which he'd exercised in years. Marcus Whitmore knelt in the dust beside the overturned wagon, studying the 2 girls through the opening with the careful observation he usually reserved for evaluating cattle or assessing land. They were identical in feature, the same pale skin, the same fine brown hair, the same determined set to their jaws, but their expressions told different stories. The girl on the left, the one who'd spoken, had fear in her eyes, but also something harder, a protective instinct already calcified into stubbornness. The girl on the right was younger seeming only in spirit, her face crumpled with grief she couldn't yet process. "What are your names?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone gentle but matter-of-fact. The kind of voice that invited trust without demanding it. The protective girl hesitated, glancing at her sister before answering. "I'm Sarah. This is my sister Emma. We're not leaving, Mama." Sarah. The name sounded too old for that small face. Emma didn't speak, just pressed her forehead against her sister's shoulder and made a sound that might have been a whimper or a prayer. Marcus had learned long ago that there was no good way to tell children their mother was dead. No words that softened the blow or made the reality any easier to absorb. But he also knew that the longer these girls stayed in that wagon, staring at their mother's body, the deeper the trauma would embed itself. He'd made enough hard decisions in his life to recognize another one looming. "Your mama needs help," he said carefully. She's hurt very badly. I need to get you both out of this wagon so I can help her properly. Can you do that for me?" Sarah shook her head with the stubbornness of a child who'd already learned that the world didn't keep its promises. "You're lying. You're going to take us away, and we won't ever see her again. We heard stories. Bad men take children away from their mothers." The accusation hit Marcus harder than expected. He looked at these two girls, huddled in the darkness, terrified and grieving, and understood that he represented every threat they'd been warned about. A stranger, a man, an authority figure who might separate them from the only parent they'd ever known. "I'm not taking you anywhere," Marcus said, and meant it with a clarity that surprised even himself. "Not without your mother, not without understanding what you need." He stood and moved around to where the woman lay, confirming what he'd already known. Margaret Chen. He found papers in her dress pocket, documents that identified her and explained the wagon's cargo. Books. Hundreds of books carefully packed in wooden crates that had scattered across the prairie when the wagon overturned. Margaret Chen, traveling from Sacramento to somewhere in Montana, had been transporting a library. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. This woman had been carrying stories, knowledge, hope, and now she lay dead in the grass, those books scattered like abandoned dreams. He found a blanket in the wagon, one that hadn't been crushed in the fall. Without looking too closely at Margaret's face, he'd learned that some images stuck with you, and he didn't need that particular memory. He covered her body respectfully. Then he turned his attention back to the girls. "Your mama is very badly hurt," he said through the wagon opening. "So badly that I can't fix it, but I can take care of you both. I can make sure you're safe and warm and fed, and I can make sure your mama is treated with respect. That's what she would want, isn't it, for you to be safe?" Sarah's face crumpled slightly, the first crack in her determined facade, but she still didn't move. Marcus realized that coercion wouldn't work here. These girls needed something more than promises. They needed proof that he wasn't the threat they'd been taught to fear. He made a decision that most ranchers in his position probably wouldn't have made. He climbed into the overturned wagon. It wasn't easy. The space was cramped, filled with the wreckage of books and supplies, and his large frame barely fit through the opening. But Marcus wedged himself into the corner opposite the girls, positioning himself so he wasn't looming or threatening, but rather present, beside them, not above them. "I'm staying," he said simply. "Not leaving you. Not until you're ready." Emma let out a small sob at this, and Sarah's eyes widened slightly. But neither girl moved away. They sat in the dim interior of that overturned wagon, two orphaned children and one weathered rancher, and waited for whatever came next. The hours that followed took on a strange quality, outside of normal time. Marcus didn't try to convince the girls to leave. Instead, he told them stories. Simple ones at first, about his ranch, about the horses he kept, about the mountains that surrounded their land. He talked in a low, steady voice, filling the silence with narrative, because silence would have left room for their terror to expand. Sarah gradually began to listen, though Emma remained largely silent, her body slowly relaxing against her sister's side as exhaustion began to overtake trauma. As the afternoon light shifted and the wagon's interior grew warmer, Marcus noticed Emma's eyes beginning to close. "Is she allowed to sleep?" Sarah asked, a note of panic creeping into her voice. Will she forget what happened if she sleeps?" "No," Marcus said. "Sleep won't take this away, but it will help her body heal. Sometimes rest is the first step toward being strong enough to face hard things." Sarah seemed to accept this. She shifted her position slightly, creating a more comfortable nest for Emma, who was already half asleep. As her sister's breathing gradually deepened, Sarah looked at Marcus with the weight of the world in her small face. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the same question that had driven Marcus's entire adult life, the push to survive, to build, to create something stable in a chaotic world. But He'd never had anyone depend on him emotionally before. His ranch hands respected him, his neighbors deferred to him, but no one needed him in the way these two girls suddenly did. "Now we figure it out," he said. "Together." He stayed in that wagon through the evening as the temperature began to drop. Sarah eventually fell asleep as well, her head tilted back against the wagon's wooden frame, her small hand still gripping her sister's. Marcus remained awake, watching them, thinking about the decisions he'd made in his life that had led him to this moment. He'd been a different man once, younger, more idealistic, more hopeful about the world's capacity for kindness, but loss had a way of calcifying people. His wife, Rebecca, had died in childbirth 8 years ago, taking with her the future he'd imagined. He'd responded by pouring himself into the ranch, building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. But success had felt hollow, a poor substitute for the connection he'd lost. Now, looking at these two sleeping girls, Marcus wondered if perhaps the world was offering him a second chance at something he'd given up on. Not a wife, not romantic love, but purpose, meaning, the chance to protect something vulnerable from a world that had already shown itself to be merciless. When full darkness fell, Marcus carefully maneuvered out of the wagon without waking the girls. He used the blanket he'd covered Margaret with to create a makeshift shelter, rigging it between the wagon and some sagebrush to block the worst of the wind. He settled himself at the wagon's opening, close enough that he could hear the girls if they woke, far enough that they wouldn't feel trapped. He thought about the practical problems ahead. The girls had no family. The documents he'd found in Margaret's possession indicated she'd been traveling alone, transporting her library to establish a school in a small Montana town that had sent her funds. The girls were supposed to be educated by that library, raised in a community that valued knowledge. Instead, they were orphaned in a landscape that had little patience for sentiment. By morning, Marcus had made his decision. He would take the girls to Millbrook, report the accident to the sheriff, and arrange for a proper burial for Margaret Chen. And then, if no family came forward, if no relatives claimed them, he would do something he'd never thought to do again. He would build a home. Not just a ranch, but a place where two small girls could grow up knowing they were wanted, where they could be safe, where they could learn and read and become something more than casualties of circumstance. It was a decision that would alter the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. But as Marcus sat in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the girls sleep, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah woke before dawn, her eyes snapping open with the alertness of a child who'd learned to be vigilant. For a moment, confusion clouded her face as she registered the unfamiliar surroundings, the overturned wagon, the strange man sitting nearby, the absence of her mother's presence. The realization seemed to hit her all over again, fresh and devastating, and her body went rigid with the effort of holding herself together. Marcus, who'd barely slept, watched her struggle with the knowledge of loss without offering empty comfort. Instead, he simply rose and moved toward them with quiet purpose. "We need to move," he said, not unkindly. "Your sister needs water, and so do you. There's a stream about a quarter-mile west. After that, we'll head to town." Sarah nodded mechanically, as though her body understood survival instructions even when her mind was fractured. She gently woke Emma, who surfaced from sleep. Slowly, confusion giving way to the same terrible remembering. This time, Emma didn't cry. She simply became very still, her small hand finding Sarah's with practiced familiarity. Marcus had brought his horse near the wagon the night before. It was a gentle mare named Stella, chosen deliberately for her calm temperament and her ability to carry riders double. He helped both girls down from the wagon. They were light as sticks, he noticed, undernourished in the way of children raised on the road, and led them toward the water. At the stream, Sarah insisted on helping Emma wash, positioning herself as caretaker despite her own shock and grief. Marcus noticed this and didn't interfere. The girls needed their rituals, their small assertions of control in a situation where everything had spiraled beyond their comprehension. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked, as they knelt at the water's edge, cupping water in their small hands and drinking with the desperation of the genuinely parched. "Forever," Sarah said, which probably meant 3 months or 3 years. The subjective experience of childhood made all duration feel eternal. "Mama said we were going to a place where people wanted to learn, where we could build a library and teach children and have a real home for the first time." "Where was home before that?" Marcus asked, watching their reflections in the water. "Nowhere," Emma whispered, speaking for the first time since the accident. Her voice was thin, fragile as dried grass. "We lived on the road. Mama said the road was our home." Sarah shot her sister a look that was equal parts protective and reproachful, as though Emma had revealed too much. But the damage was done. Marcus understood now that these girls had never known stability, never had a place they truly belonged. Their mother had been attempting to build that for them, had been transporting an entire library across the country to establish a school in a community that had promised to receive her. And fate had intervened with brutal indifference. The ride into Millbrook took most of the morning. Marcus had fashioned a makeshift seat for both girls on Stella, positioning them in front of him while he rode his stallion alongside. Sarah sat rigid and alert, watching the landscape pass with the wariness of someone who'd learned to catalogue exits and assess danger. Emma was smaller, seemed younger, kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as though looking hard enough might change what awaited them. Millbrook was a small town, the kind of place that thrived on livestock commerce and the occasional mineral find. The main street consisted of a general store, a saloon, a bank, a livery, and various other structures that catered to ranching operations. The sheriff's office stood near the center, a modest building with bars on one window. Sheriff Thomas Garrett was a man in his 60s, weathered by decades of maintaining order in frontier territory. He looked up from his desk when Marcus entered with the 2 girls, and his expression shifted from curiosity to grim understanding. "Found them?" Garrett asked, already reaching for pen and paper. "Overturned wagon, about 12 miles east," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "Woman named Margaret Chen, dead on impact. Looks like. She'd been transporting books, heading to establish a school. These 2 are hers." Garrett looked at the girls with the compassion of a man who'd seen enough tragedies to understand their weight without pretending to minimize it. "Names? Sarah and Emma," Marcus said, noticing that Sarah had moved closer to him, her small hand gripping his pant leg. "They're twins, 7 or 8 years old. You know that for certain?" Garrett pulled out a ledger. "Because we'll need to post notices, try to locate relatives, follow proper procedure." Marcus felt Sarah's grip tighten. The woman had documents. "I'll bring them by." But from what she told the girls, there's no family. She was heading to Cedar Falls. It's a settlement about 40 miles north. They'd invited her to establish a school there. Garrett nodded slowly, already writing. "I'll contact Cedar Falls, see if they can verify her story. In the meantime, what about the girls? We don't have facilities for children here. The nearest orphanage is in Helena, 3 days' ride." The word hung in the air like a curse. Orphanage. Marcus felt Sarah flinch against his leg. He knew what those places were. Repositories for unwanted children, places where survival often mattered more than childhood, where kindness was rare and cruelty was systematic. "I'll take them," Marcus heard himself say, "temporarily while you sort out the details. But they're not going to an institution." Garrett looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested reassessment. "That's a significant undertaking, Whitmore. You're a bachelor, you've got a ranch to run. These are traumatized children who've just lost their mother. You sure that's practical? It wasn't practical, Marcus knew this. Running a large operation required his attention, his presence, his energy. Two grieving children would demand exactly the same things. But he looked down at Sarah, at the fierce determination in her small face, at Emma visible through the doorway where she'd remained, shoulders hunched as though bracing against invisible blows, and practicality seemed irrelevant. "I'm sure," he said. The ride to Whitmore Ranch took the remainder of the day. It was located in the high country, about 15 miles from town, surrounded by rolling grassland and backed by mountains that turned purple at sunset. The main house was substantial but not ostentatious, 2 stories of red brick and white trim, with a wide porch and multiple outbuildings. It was the home of a successful rancher, but it was also clearly a bachelor's domain. There was efficiency in the design, but no softness. No evidence that anyone other than a man lived there. Marcus had 4 ranch hands working for him, all experienced enough that they didn't ask questions when he arrived with 2 small girls. He introduced Sarah and Emma to his foreman, a grizzled man named Henry, who'd worked for Marcus for 7 years and had learned not to pry into his employer's decisions. "They'll need rooms set up," Marcus instructed. "The 2 small bedrooms on the 2nd floor, the ones that look over the east pasture, and we'll need to arrange for supplies. Clothes, shoes that fit, bedding. We'll need to find a woman who can help with their care during the day while I'm working." Henry nodded, already moving into action. He'd worked for Marcus long enough to understand that when the boss made a decision, the appropriate response was implementation, not interrogation. That first night, Sarah and Emma were given a bath and clean clothes. Marcus's housekeeper, a woman named Dorothy who came 3 days a week, had been called in to assist. Dorothy was a widow herself, had raised 2 sons alone, and seemed to understand without being told that these children needed gentle handling and absolute permission to grieve without judgment. After a modest dinner, Marcus took them upstairs to their rooms. They were simple but comfortable, each with a bed, a wardrobe, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the darkening landscape. Emma seemed to like hers immediately, gravitating toward the window with quiet interest. But Sarah hesitated in the hallway between the 2 rooms. "Are they separate?" she asked, and Marcus heard the fear beneath the question. The fear that she and Emma would be separated, that this arrangement was temporary, that she would lose her sister as well as her mother. "They connect," Marcus said, pointing to a door that had been left open between the 2 rooms. "You can go between them whenever you want. You won't be separated." Sarah seemed to accept this, though she continued to look uncertain. "What happens next?" It was the same question Emma had asked in the wagon. Marcus was beginning to understand that these girls had spent their lives in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing what would come next, dependent entirely on their mother's choices and the world's random cruelty. "Tomorrow we figure out your lives," Marcus said. "Today we rest. Your mother's been laid to rest properly, the sheriff arranged it. We'll have a proper service in a few days, once the details are finalized. But tonight, you sleep. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to separate you." Sarah nodded slowly, seeming to measure his words against her experience of how the world actually worked. Then she turned and went into her room, closing the door carefully behind her. Marcus stood in the hallway, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. Somewhere in the darkness, 2 small girls were processing the loss of their world. And somewhere in his own heart, a man who'd thought himself incapable of hope was beginning to consider the possibility that second chances might exist. But hope, Marcus was learning, was a complicated thing. It carried with it the possibility of failure, of loss, of discovering that good intentions weren't sufficient to overcome the weight of circumstance. As he descended the stairs and returned to his study, he was already thinking ahead to the obstacles that would inevitably arise. A town that judged men by conventional standards wouldn't look kindly on an unmarried rancher raising 2 young girls. His business associates would question the arrangement. And the girls themselves, traumatized and orphaned, would need more than a safe place to sleep. They would need healing, education, stability, and the kind of patient love that couldn't be rushed or forced. Marcus poured himself a measure of whiskey and sat at his desk, staring at the papers Garrett had given him from Margaret Chen's belongings. Her journals were among them, filled with notes about her, teaching philosophy, her plans for the school, her dreams for Sarah and Emma's futures. She'd written extensively about her daughter's intelligence, their curiosity, their potential. "I'm going to give them what you planned," Marcus said aloud to the ghost of a woman he'd never met. "I don't know if I'm capable of it, but I'm going to try." The house was quiet around him, full of the small sounds of children sleeping, and Marcus Whitmore settled in to begin the work of becoming something he'd never imagined being: a father. The first week passed in a blur of necessary logistics that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Sarah and Emma emerged from their rooms the morning after arrival, looking diminished, as though grief had physically shrunk them overnight. They moved through the ranch house like ghosts, touching nothing, speaking only when directly addressed, their eyes constantly tracking exits and assessing whether this place might vanish as suddenly as everything else in their lives had. Dorothy, the housekeeper, proved invaluable. She cooked meals the girls would actually eat, simple foods that didn't overwhelm their shocked systems, and she asked questions without demanding answers. By the third day, Emma had begun to tentatively follow Dorothy around the kitchen while she worked. Sarah remained more guarded, but even she had started to relax slightly in Dorothy's presence, the way frightened animals gradually trust a gentle hand. The practical problems, however, multiplied daily. Neither girl had shoes that fit. Their clothes, salvaged from the wagon, were worn thin and too small. Sarah had started her cycle. Marcus only discovered this when Dorothy pulled him aside with the kind of embarrassed discretion of a woman who understood he had no experience with such matters and required supplies he had no knowledge of. Obtaining. Emma had developed a cough that wouldn't ease, forcing Marcus to send for Dr. James Whitfield from town. The doctor arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, examining Emma with the competence of a man who'd practiced medicine on the frontier long enough to handle any ailment with equal calm. After listening to her chest and asking questions about her medical history, he prescribed rest, warm liquids, and a tincture that smelled of licorice and something vaguely medicinal. "She's malnourished," Whitfield said as he packed his bag, glancing at Sarah as well. "Both of them are. They need consistent food, warmth, and stability. The cough should ease in a few weeks if she's kept dry and warm." "How much do I owe you?" Marcus asked. $2, Whitfield said, then paused. "Though I'll admit I'm curious about the arrangement. Dorothy mentioned you're raising them alone." "Their mother?" "Dead," Marcus said flatly. "Wagon accident. No family that we can locate. They were headed to Cedar Falls, where their mother was supposed to establish a school." Whitfield nodded slowly, studying Marcus with the kind of assessment a physician learned to make about character and capacity. "That's a significant undertaking, Whitmore. Have you thought about what happens when they're older? When they need education, social opportunities, the kind of things young women require to build lives?" It was a fair question, and one Marcus had been avoiding. "I'll figure it out as it comes." "See that you do," Whitfield said, not unkindly. "These girls are resilient, but they'll need more than shelter and food. They'll need hope that their futures include something beyond survival." After the doctor left, Marcus found Sarah in the library, a room he rarely entered, filled with books that had belonged to previous residents of the ranch. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by volumes, reading with the fierce concentration of someone who'd learned that stories were an escape from unbearable reality. "Your mother had books," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. "Hundreds of them. She was bringing them to Cedar Falls to start a school." Sarah looked up, her expression shifting from defensive to something almost hungry. "Are they still there?" "The books?" Marcus hadn't thought about them since discovering Margaret's body. The scattered cargo had seemed irrelevant compared to the more pressing matter of the orphaned children. But now he realized their significance. "I'll check," he promised. "The wagon's been brought to town. If they're salvageable, we'll recover them." This small promise seemed to matter more than anything else Marcus had done since bringing the girls to the ranch. Sarah's grip on her book relaxed slightly, and for the first time since arriving, he saw something other than fear and grief cross her face. It was anticipation. That same afternoon, Marcus rode into Millbrook to speak with Sheriff Garrett about the wagon's contents. What he found was worse than he'd expected. The books had been sorted through by curious townspeople, some taken, some damaged by weather exposure, the crates themselves dismantled for the wood. The loss felt almost physical. Margaret's life's work, scattered and stolen by people who'd seen discarded property as an opportunity for salvage. "I'm sorry," Garrett said, seeing Marcus's reaction. "I tried to post a watch, but people assumed the cargo was abandoned. Without family to claim it, there was no clear ownership. I recovered what I could, stored it at the livery, but there's maybe 70 books out of what you're telling me was several hundred." 70 was better than nothing. Marcus arranged for them to be transported to the ranch, and that evening he showed Sarah what had been salvaged. She wept, not the broken sobbing of fresh grief, but something deeper. Tears of mourning, not just for her mother's death, but for the loss of her mother's dream. "We can rebuild it," Marcus said, though he wasn't certain that was true. "Your mother had plans. We can continue them." "How?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "We're just two girls. And you're a rancher, not a teacher." "Then we learn," Marcus said. "We'll teach each other. You teach me what your mother taught you. I'll help you become the woman she wanted you to become." It was an impractical promise, but Sarah seemed to need impracticality in that moment, something to hold on to beyond the weight of loss. By the second week, news of Marcus Whitmore's unconventional household arrangement had spread through Millbrook with the speed of prairie fire. The reactions were mixed, but predominantly skeptical. At the general store, Marcus overheard whispered conversations that died as soon as they noticed his presence. At the saloon, which he rarely frequented, he was told by the bartender that some of the local women were concerned about propriety. It was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, wife of the largest cattle broker in the region, who made the first direct move. She arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, unannounced, her carriage bearing the insignia of someone accustomed to access and deference. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, accepting the offer of tea that Dorothy hastily prepared. "I won't waste time with niceties. The community has expressed concerns about your living situation." "What concerns?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. "An unmarried man, living alone with two young girls," Eleanor said bluntly. "It raises questions. Questions about propriety, about the girls' reputations, about whether you're truly the best guardian for them." "They're orphaned children who lost their mother," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "I'm providing shelter and care until alternative arrangements can be made." "Alternative arrangements," Eleanor repeated. "Such as?" "I haven't determined that yet." Eleanor set down her teacup with careful precision. "There are institutions designed for children in this situation. We could facilitate their placement in a proper home. Helena's orphanage comes highly recommended." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest at the word home. These girls needed more than an institution. They needed consistency, kindness, someone who would advocate for them when the world was indifferent. "They're staying here," he said flatly, "even when it damages your reputation, even when it makes you the subject of community scrutiny." Eleanor's tone suggested she was testing his resolve. "Because I can tell you, Mr. Whitmore, society has expectations. Young girls require proper female supervision to develop into respectable women. Your arrangement, however well-intentioned, cannot possibly meet those standards." After Eleanor departed, Marcus sat in his study, feeling a frustration he hadn't experienced in years. The problem she'd identified was legitimate, even if her proposed solution was unacceptable. Sarah and Emma did need female guidance. They needed education, socialization, exposure to the kind of refined skills that would eventually allow them to function in society without stigma. What they didn't need was to be warehoused in an institution with hundreds of other orphaned children treated as problems to be managed rather than people to be nurtured. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised him as much as it would eventually surprise Sarah and Emma. He began writing letters. To educators in Helena, to women in Millbrook who had reputation for compassion, to anyone who might help him understand how to create the kind of environment these girls needed. He also wrote to Cedar Falls, to the organization that had invited Margaret to establish a school. Perhaps they could provide guidance on educational philosophy, on curriculum, on the kind of resources that would allow him to honor Margaret's memory by continuing her work with her daughters. The responses began arriving within 2 weeks. Some were encouraging, offering suggestions and referrals. Others were cautionary, reinforcing Eleanor's concerns about propriety. But one response, from the superintendent of schools in Helena, proved transformative. Dr. William Prescott wrote that while Marcus's guardianship raised questions, his commitment to the girls' education demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare. Dr. Prescott suggested that if Marcus could hire a qualified female educator to live at the ranch as a tutor and companion to the girls, the arrangement would become not just acceptable, but potentially admirable. A qualified female educator. Marcus read those words multiple times, understanding that the solution to his problem required him to invite another person into his carefully constructed solitary life. Someone who would need employment, housing, and acceptance of a situation that was unconventional by any standard. He placed advertisements in the Helena papers and in a national education publication. The response was sparse. Most qualified educators either had positions or had no desire to relocate to remote Montana ranch country. But there were 3 applications, including one from a woman named Miss Caroline Thorne, who had been teaching at a girls' academy in Denver and was seeking a position that offered more independence and the opportunity to develop her own curriculum. Marcus wrote to her immediately, describing the situation honestly. 2 orphaned girls, ages 7 and 8, recently bereaved, requiring both education and emotional support. The position would involve living at the ranch, creating curriculum, teaching both academic subjects and the social skills necessary for young women to navigate society successfully. It was, he admitted, an unusual position for an unusual situation. Caroline Thorne's response arrived 3 weeks later. She wrote that she was intrigued by the challenge, that she had experience with orphaned children and unconventional educational approaches. She asked detailed questions about the girls' current knowledge level, their interests, their emotional state. And most importantly, she asked about Marcus's vision for their futures, not what he assumed they should become, but what he hoped they might become if given the opportunity to choose. No one had asked Marcus that question before. It forced him to consider the girls not as problems to solve, but as possibilities to nurture. It forced him to articulate hopes he'd barely acknowledged to himself. He spent an entire evening composing his response, trying to explain that he wanted Sarah and Emma to have choices, to receive education that would allow them to become teachers like their mother, or scholars, or anything else they chose. To grow up knowing they were valued for their minds and their character, not for their ability to conform to society's expectations. By the time he finished writing, Marcus understood that he'd crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply providing shelter to 2 orphaned children. He was attempting to build something larger, a household structured around their growth, their education, their potential. It would require sacrifice, vulnerability, and a willingness to let someone new into the carefully controlled world he'd built since Rebecca's death. But looking at Sarah reading in the library, at Emma's cough finally beginning to ease, at the slow return of childhood to their faces, Marcus recognized that the sacrifice was already worth the cost. All that remained was to convince Caroline Thorne that taking this position wouldn't be the biggest mistake of her professional life. Caroline Thorne arrived on a Tuesday in late October, bringing with her 3 trunks of belongings and an expression of composed determination that suggested she'd already assessed the situation and decided it was worth the considerable risk. She was 32 years old, unmarried, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a posture that communicated quiet authority. Marcus had sent a carriage to collect her from the station in Millbrook, and as she descended onto the ranch's entrance road, he realized that every assumption the community had made about his household was about to be tested. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, extending her hand with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to occupy space. "Thank you for the opportunity." The girls' letters were remarkable. Their mother was clearly an educator of considerable skill. Marcus shook her hand, noting the calluses on her fingers, evidence of long hours of writing and hard work. "They're reserved still. The loss is recent. But they're intelligent and hungry to learn." "Good," Caroline said simply. "Intelligent children are far easier to educate than compliant ones. Shall we meet them?" Sarah and Emma were waiting in the parlor, scrubbed clean and dressed in new dresses that Dorothy had helped them select. They looked small and uncertain, as though meeting a new adult authority figure might result in further upheaval. But Caroline approached them with none of the condescension adults typically employed with children. "You're Sarah and Emma," she said, sitting down on a chair rather than remaining standing, a deliberate choice that brought her eye level with them. "Your mother left some detailed notes about your educational progress. She was building a comprehensive curriculum that I'd like to continue, but first I need to understand what you know and what you want to learn. The learning part is important. Education is useless if it's forced on someone without considering what they actually care about." Emma glanced at Sarah, seeking permission to speak. Sarah nodded slightly, and Emma said quietly, "Mama taught us to read. She said reading was the way out of being stuck." "Your mother was correct," Caroline said. "Reading is a tool, but so is writing, mathematics, history, science. What did you like to read?" "Everything," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as the conversation moved to territory she understood. "Mama had books about exploration, about discoveries, about people who did things everyone said were impossible." Caroline smiled, and it transformed her stern features into something genuinely warm. "Then we have much to discuss. But first, let me settle in, and then we'll establish what your day will look like. I suspect it will be quite different from what you're used to." Over the following week, Caroline established a structure that transformed the ranch house into something between a home and a school. She claimed the small sitting room adjacent to the girls' bedrooms as a classroom, arranging it with a large desk for instruction and comfortable seating for reading and discussion. She implemented a schedule. Mornings were dedicated to academic subjects, mathematics, reading, composition, history. Afternoons included practical skills, cooking, needlework, management of household accounts. Evenings were reserved for reading aloud, during which Caroline, Marcus, and the girls would gather to discuss literature and ideas. What surprised Marcus was how quickly Caroline integrated herself into the household without attempting to replace the authority he'd established. She deferred to his decisions about the girls' discipline and welfare, but she also didn't hesitate to challenge him when she believed he was wrong. When Marcus suggested the girls take a lighter academic load due to their grief, Caroline refused. "Grief requires processing, not avoidance," she told him directly, speaking in his study after the girls had gone to bed. "Education provides structure and purpose. It gives them something to focus on beyond loss. We handle their emotional needs, certainly, but we don't diminish their intellectual development because they're sad." "They've lost their mother," Marcus said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "Yes," Caroline agreed, "and they'll carry that loss for the rest of their lives. But Sarah has an extraordinary capacity for abstract thinking, and Emma has unusual spatial reasoning. If we fail to develop those gifts because we're afraid of pushing them too hard, we're compounding their loss. We're suggesting that their intelligence is less important than our discomfort with their pain." It was a perspective Marcus hadn't considered. He found himself yielding to her logic, watching as Caroline designed lessons that challenged the girls, while also allowing them space to process their grief through the learning itself. A lesson on ancient civilizations became a discussion about how societies honor their dead. A mathematics problem about calculating crop yields became an exploration of how their mother had planned to sustain her school financially. By the middle of November, the most visible sign of Caroline's impact was Sarah. The girl who had been fierce and protective at the wagon was gradually transforming into someone who engaged with ideas, who asked questions, who was beginning to imagine futures beyond mere survival. Emma, always the quieter twin, was blooming in a different way. Her artistic inclinations were encouraged, and Caroline had her creating detailed illustrations that accompanied their lessons. But Caroline's arrival also intensified the community's scrutiny. Eleanor Hartwell arrived for an unannounced visit within days, ostensibly to assess whether the situation had improved, but actually to determine whether hiring a female educator absolved Marcus of impropriety or simply complicated it further. "Miss Thorne," Eleanor said, examining Caroline as though assessing livestock, "you've come from Denver? That's quite a distance for a teaching position." "I came because the work interested me," Caroline said, meeting Eleanor's gaze with absolute calm. "I've spent 10 years in conventional schools, with conventional expectations. This position offers the opportunity to develop an educational philosophy without institutional constraints. Surely you understand that your living here raises certain questions," Eleanor pressed. "An unmarried woman, in a bachelor's household, however justified by professional necessity. It raises questions only in the minds of people who've decided the answer before asking them," Caroline said flatly. "Mr. Whitmore hired me to educate and care for 2 orphaned girls. That I'm capable of doing my job effectively is all that should concern anyone. My marital status is irrelevant to my qualifications." After Eleanor left, Marcus found himself genuinely grateful for Caroline's directness. She'd articulated something he'd been struggling to express, that the community's judgment was less about actual impropriety and more about their discomfort with arrangements that didn't fit conventional patterns. December brought a new challenge. The first snow fell heavily, and with it came word that the school in Cedar Falls, the place Margaret had been heading, was interested in supporting Sarah and Emma's education. They sent a letter expressing interest in the girls' progress and offering to provide curriculum, materials, and educational correspondence. But they also raised a question that had been lurking beneath the surface since Marcus's initial decision to keep the girls. What was the long-term plan? Cedar Falls wanted to know if Marcus intended to keep the girls through their education or if he was preparing them for eventual placement elsewhere. They asked whether he was planning a conventional path for them: marriage, household management, traditional female roles, or whether he supported Caroline's more progressive approach to their development. Marcus realized he didn't have clear answers. He'd been operating on instinct since finding them at the wagon, making decisions as problems arose rather than developing a coherent vision. But now, with Cedar Falls asking directly and Caroline asking implicitly through her lesson design, he had to articulate what he actually wanted for Sarah and Emma. He spent an evening in his study composing a response to Cedar Falls. In it, he wrote that Sarah and Emma would remain at the ranch as long as they needed stability and education. He wrote that he supported their intellectual development without limitations based on their gender. He wrote that he hoped they would have choices about their futures to become teachers, scholars, community leaders, or anything else they chose, based on their abilities and interests, rather than society's expectations. Most importantly, he wrote that he was committed to giving them what their mother had started: the knowledge and tools to build lives of meaning and purpose. When he finished writing, Marcus reread the letter several times, struck by how much his thinking had evolved since finding two terrified girls in an overturned wagon. He'd moved from immediate rescue to long-term commitment to active investment in their futures. Caroline found him at his desk, the letter waiting to be sealed. "Is that for Cedar Falls?" she asked. "Yes, articulating what we're doing here, why we're doing it." Caroline read the letter carefully, and when she finished, she looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect. "This is a significant commitment. Do you understand what you're promising?" "I'm promising them choices," Marcus said. "I'm promising that they get to decide who they become, that I won't force them into conventional lives just because society prefers predictability." "That's admirable," Caroline said, "but it's also lonely. You're essentially committing to a path that few people in this community will understand or approve of. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about the women who'd whispered about his arrangement, about Eleanor Hartwell's barely concealed judgment, about the assumptions people made based on what they saw rather than what actually existed in his household. "I've been alone since my wife died," he said quietly. "I've been running this ranch, building something that doesn't ultimately matter to anyone but me. The girls, they matter. Sarah's questions matter. Emma's drawings matter. Creating the kind of environment where they can flourish matters in a way that cattle prices and land acquisition never did." Caroline nodded slowly. "Then we'd better make sure we do this properly, because half measures won't be sufficient for what you've started." Over the following weeks, as winter deepened, a rhythm emerged that felt almost like normalcy. Sarah was reading at a level significantly above her age, consuming books from the ranch library with voracious intensity. Emma had become increasingly accomplished at drawing, and Caroline was teaching her to use art as a form of documenting and processing emotion. Marcus found himself spending evenings listening to the girls explain what they'd learned, watching their minds engage with ideas, feeling a sense of purpose he'd thought lost when Rebecca died. But Christmas brought an unexpected complication. A letter arrived from Helena, addressed to Marcus, from a woman named Mrs. Sarah Ashford. She introduced herself as a distant cousin of Margaret Chen, recently located through church contacts. She was writing to inform Marcus that she intended to petition for guardianship of the girls. According to her letter, she'd been unaware of Margaret's death and the girls' circumstances until recent weeks, but she believed family guardianship was preferable to the current arrangement with a bachelor and hired help. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest as he read the letter. Mrs. Ashford was respectable, married, living in Helena. From a conventional standpoint, she would be considered more suitable than Marcus. The courts would likely favor her petition, and despite everything he'd built with Sarah and Emma, despite the educational structure Caroline had created, despite the commitment he'd made, he suddenly understood the fragility of his position. That evening, he called Caroline and the girls together in the parlor. He didn't hide the letter or soften the situation. Sarah and Emma needed to understand what was happening, and they needed to hear the truth directly from him. "A relative of your mother's has asked to be your guardian," he said, watching their expressions shift from confusion to fear. "A woman named Mrs. Ashford in Helena. She has rights, legally, that I don't have. If she petitions the courts, they may rule in her favor." "Are we leaving?" Emma whispered. "I don't know yet," Marcus said honestly, "but I wanted you to know what's happening before the community hears about it and brings you rumors. We're going to fight this, if you want us to. But I need you to understand that fighting means a court hearing, means people asking questions about you and me and this household. It won't be easy." Sarah looked at Caroline, then at Marcus. "Is she going to take us away?" "I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent that," Marcus said. "But I can't make promises about outcomes I can't control. What I can promise is that I won't give up without fighting." That night, Marcus sat in his study writing to Judge Brennan, the same judge who'd handled the initial accident report. He was requesting an emergency meeting to discuss guardianship petition procedures. He was also writing to Dr. Prescott in Helena, the superintendent who'd suggested hiring Caroline, asking for a written statement, supporting his arrangement, and testifying to the girl's progress. And he was preparing for a battle he hadn't anticipated, one that would test not just his commitment to the girls, but his willingness to expose his household to the kind of public scrutiny that would either validate his decisions or condemn them as the foolish choices of a man who'd overestimated his capacity to love. Judge Brennan agreed to see Marcus on a cold December afternoon in his chambers, a modest office that smelled of tobacco and old paper. The judge was the same man who'd processed Margaret's death records 3 months earlier, and he greeted Marcus with the weariness of someone who'd seen enough human drama to recognize patterns. "Guardianship petition," Brennan said, reviewing the documents that had been filed by Mrs. Ashford's attorney. "She's claiming family relationship and arguing that a bachelor's household, however well-intentioned, cannot provide the stability and moral guidance that young girls require during their formative years. She hasn't seen those girls in their lives," Marcus said, controlling the anger that threatened to spill into his voice. "She learned they existed 2 months ago. I've been providing for them since their mother died. I've hired an educator, created structure, invested everything into their welfare." "Which is admirable," Brennan said, setting down the petition. "But admirable doesn't override blood relation and social convention. Mrs. Ashford is respectable, married, and living in a conventional household. From a legal standpoint, she has legitimate claims. And from an actual standpoint?" Marcus pressed. Brennan removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that suggested weariness rather than certainty. "From an actual standpoint, I've learned in 30 years of judicial work that what's legally legitimate isn't always what's morally right. But the law doesn't account for morality very well. The law accounts for stability, propriety, and family connection. Your arrangement, however genuine your commitment, is unconventional on all 3 counts." The hearing was scheduled for January 10th. That gave Marcus 5 weeks to prepare, 5 weeks to gather evidence of his capacity to parent, 5 weeks to convince a judge that love and commitment mattered more than convention. It wasn't much time. He immediately contacted Dr. Prescott, who responded within a week with a lengthy letter documenting Caroline's qualifications and attesting to the girls' remarkable progress in their academic pursuits. Prescott wrote that Sarah's reading comprehension was extraordinary, that Emma's artistic development was unusual for her age, and that both girls demonstrated emotional resilience that suggested adequate care and psychological support. He concluded by stating that removing them from their current environment would constitute unnecessary trauma and would likely impede their development. Dr. Morrison, the local physician, provided a medical assessment confirming that both girls were healthy, well-nourished, and free from signs of neglect or abuse. He added a personal note, expressing his opinion that Marcus Whitmore was among the most conscientious men he knew, and that the girls' welfare was clearly his primary concern. Dorothy, the housekeeper, insisted on speaking with Marcus's attorney about her observations. She testified in a written statement that the girls were cared for meticulously, that Marcus disciplined them fairly, that he spent substantial time with them despite his ranch responsibilities, and that she'd never witnessed anything but genuine affection between them. Henry, the ranch foreman, wrote that Mr. Whitmore had never allowed his personal circumstances to interfere with ranch operations, that he was a man of principle and integrity, and that he'd never seen him treat any one employee or guest with anything but respect and fairness. But as impressive as these testimonials were, Marcus knew they wouldn't be sufficient. Judges didn't rule based on character witnesses alone. They ruled based on what society deemed appropriate, and society had made its position clear through Eleanor Hartwell and the whispers that had followed Caroline's arrival. It was Caroline who suggested a strategy that Marcus initially rejected as too radical. She came to his study one evening in early January, carrying Sarah's latest essay, a piece about why education should be available to all people, regardless of gender or class. "This is remarkable work," Caroline said, setting it on his desk. "She's thinking at a level significantly above her age. But more than that, she's thinking about justice, about fairness, about what she believes is right. That's the kind of thinking that will serve her well in life." "It's good work," Marcus agreed, sensing there was more to Caroline's visit than literary assessment. "The judge needs to see this," Caroline said bluntly. "He needs to understand that what you've created here isn't some sentimental arrangement. It's an educational environment that's producing results. The girls aren't just surviving with you, they're thriving. They're developing intellectually and emotionally in ways that Mrs. Ashford's conventional household couldn't facilitate." "The judge won't care about essays," Marcus said. "He'll care about propriety." "Then we make propriety work for you," Caroline said. "The judge has daughters, I learned from inquiries. He cares about their education, about their futures. If we can demonstrate that you're providing Sarah and Emma with opportunities that exceed what Mrs. Ashford could offer." We reframe the question from, "Is this conventional?" to, "Is this in the girl's best interest?" It was a gamble, but Marcus was beginning to understand that conventional approaches wouldn't work anyway. Mrs. Ashford had convention on her side. The only advantage Marcus possessed was the reality of what he'd actually built. So he authorized Caroline to prepare educational portfolios for both girls, examples of their work, documentation of their progress, evidence of intellectual and emotional development. The night before the hearing, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked through the house, finding Sarah and Emma already awake, both of them sitting in the library in their night dresses, reading by lamplight, despite the late hour. When they saw him, they immediately closed their books with the guilt of children caught doing something forbidden. "Couldn't sleep either?" Marcus asked, settling into a chair opposite them. "We're scared," Emma said simply. Sarah glared at her sister for the admission, but the damage was already done. "I know," Marcus said. "Tomorrow is important. A judge is going to listen to arguments about who should be your guardian. Mrs. Ashford wants to be your guardian. I want to be your guardian. The judge will decide." "What if he says, we have to go with her?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested she'd already contemplated this possibility. "Then you'll go, and I'll miss you terribly," Marcus said, honoring her with honesty rather than false reassurance. "But that's not what I believe will happen. I believe that when the judge understands what we've built here, when he sees how you've grown and learned and recovered from your mother's death, he'll recognize that this is a home worth preserving." "And if he doesn't?" Emma pressed. Marcus paused, unable to construct a comforting lie that wouldn't be insulting to their intelligence. "Then we'll accept his decision and make the best of whatever comes next. But we won't go into tomorrow believing that outcome is inevitable. We're going to fight for what we believe is right, and we're going to do it with absolute honesty about who we are and what we've accomplished together." The courthouse was crowded the morning of the hearing. News of the case had spread through Millbrook and beyond. An unmarried rancher attempting to retain guardianship of two orphaned girls against the petition of respectable family members was exactly the kind of scandal that drew public interest. The gallery was filled with curious townspeople, including Eleanor Hartwell and several other women from her social circle. Mrs. Sarah Ashford was present as well, a woman in her mid-50s, dressed in fashionable black, her expression composed and sympathetic. She brought with her an attorney from Helena, who was accustomed to winning cases. Judge Brennan called the hearing to order, and the Ashford attorney immediately presented his case. Mrs. Ashford was family. She had resources, a stable home, and the respectable standing required to raise young girls. She loved her cousin Margaret and grieved for her death. She wanted to honor Margaret's memory by raising her daughters properly, with the kind of feminine guidance and social structure necessary for their development. The children have been well cared for by Mr. Whitmore, the attorney acknowledged, but the arrangement is fundamentally inappropriate. An unmarried man managing a large ranch operation cannot possibly provide the attention and emotional nurturing that young girls require. Furthermore, his household has become the subject of considerable community scrutiny regarding propriety. Removing the girls from this situation and placing them in a conventional home would protect their futures and honor their mother's memory far more effectively. Marcus's attorney, a sharp woman named Frances Caldwell, who'd taken the case at a reduced rate because she believed in its merit, stood for defense. She began by establishing the timeline of Marcus's care, the immediate response to the accident, the arrangements for proper burial, the creation of a stable household within weeks. She presented the testimonials from Dr. Prescott, Dr. Morrison, Dorothy, and Henry. Then she called Marcus to the stand. The questioning was designed to establish his commitment and competence. He described finding the girls, the decision to care for them, the process of creating appropriate living conditions. He talked about hiring Caroline, about the educational structure she'd implemented, about his specific hopes for their futures. When the Ashford attorney cross-examined, he attempted to trap Marcus into admissions of inadequacy. Did he lack experience parenting? Yes. Had he made mistakes in his initial approach to their care? Undoubtedly. Wasn't it true that children required a mother figure? Children benefited from maternal guidance, but that guidance didn't have to come from a biological mother if other capable women were present in the household. And how much time do you spend with these girls daily? The attorney pressed. It varies, Marcus said. Between ranch responsibilities and their education, I'd estimate 2 to 3 hours on weekdays, more on Sundays. But quality of time matters more than quantity. The moments I spend with them are focused and intentional. Isn't it true that their actual daily care is handled by your housekeeper and their educator? Their daily care is a shared responsibility, Marcus said. Dorothy manages household logistics, Caroline manages education, and I manage their emotional welfare, their discipline, their relationship to this ranch, and to their future. It's a partnership designed specifically to meet their needs. Caroline was called to testify next. She presented the girls' educational portfolios, describing Sarah's advanced reading comprehension and Emma's unusual artistic ability. She detailed the curriculum she'd designed and explained how it honored Margaret's educational philosophy while adapting to the ranch environment. In your professional opinion, Miss Thorne, Caldwell asked, would moving these girls to a conventional household impact their educational progress? Significantly, Caroline said with absolute certainty. They've developed momentum in their learning. They've become excited about education in ways that suggest Margaret's approach, seeing learning as liberation rather than obligation, has taken root. Moving them to a conventional educational environment, where girls are typically educated primarily for domestic purposes, would likely extinguish that spark. When the Ashford attorney cross-examined, he attempted to suggest that Caroline's progressive educational philosophy was itself a problem. Wasn't it true that such approaches were considered radical? Wasn't conventional education more appropriate for young girls? Caroline responded coolly that conventional education had traditionally served the purpose of rendering women docile and dependent, which seemed counterproductive if one's goal was developing their full potential. The turning point came when Sarah herself was called to testify. At 9 years old, she was young to serve as witness testimony, but her clarity of thought and remarkable eloquence made a deep impression on the judge. She described her mother's death, her fear at the wagon, Marcus's promise that he would join her rather than remove her from her mother's side. He kept that promise, Sarah said, her voice steady. He stayed with us. He made sure Mama was buried properly. He created a home for Emma and me, and he gave us Miss Caroline to teach us the things Mama wanted us to know. Mrs. Ashford is a stranger. I don't want to live with a stranger. The testimony was simple and devastating in its honesty. Judge Brennan's expression shifted as he listened, something in his stern features softening slightly. When the hearing concluded, Brennan announced that he would issue a written decision within 2 weeks. As Marcus and the girls left the courtroom, he felt suspended between hope and dread. He'd presented his case honestly. He'd demonstrated his commitment and Caroline's competence. But he'd also confronted the reality that judges ruled based on law and precedent, not emotion. That evening, as he sat in the study going through account ledgers without actually seeing them, Caroline knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She carried 2 cups of hot tea. "You presented yourself honestly," she said, setting a cup on the desk. "You didn't pretend to be something you're not. That matters." "Does it?" Marcus asked. "Or is this just a comfortable delusion we're both maintaining?" "The judge has daughters," Caroline said simply, "and daughters educated by a woman like you, one who values their intellectual development, tend to grow into women who make their own decisions rather than accepting the decisions others make for them. Brennan knows this. The question is whether he values that outcome enough to rule unconventionally." 2 weeks became 3, then 4. Marcus went through the motions of ranch life, but every moment was colored by the uncertainty of the pending decision. He found himself watching Sarah and Emma with heightened awareness, trying to memorize their individual qualities in case the decision went against him. Finally, on the first Monday of February, a messenger arrived with an envelope bearing Judge Brennan's seal. Marcus took it to his study and sat for several minutes before opening it, unable to bear the thought of reading words that might take everything from him. When he finally unfolded the decision, his hands trembled. Marcus read the judge's decision twice, then a third time, unable to believe the words remained the same with each reading. In considering this case, the court has examined the legal claims of both parties and the evidence presented regarding the best interests of the minor children, Sarah and Emma Chen, while Mrs. Sarah Ashford has legitimate standing as a blood relative. The overwhelming evidence presented demonstrates that the current guardianship arrangement is meeting the children's physical, emotional, and intellectual needs in ways that a change of guardian would likely disrupt. The court finds that Mr. Marcus Whitmore has demonstrated exceptional commitment to these children's welfare, that he has created a household environment conducive to their growth and development, and that the educational opportunities available to them under his guardianship exceed those typically available to children of their age and circumstance. Furthermore, the children themselves have expressed preference for remaining in their current home, and their testimony regarding their sense of safety and purpose in this environment was compelling and credible. Therefore, the petition for guardianship change is hereby denied. Mr. Marcus Whitmore is confirmed as legal guardian of Sarah and Emma Chen. This decision is made with the understanding that guardianship is a sacred trust and that Mr. Whitmore has demonstrated his awareness of that responsibility. However, the court strongly recommends that Mr. Whitmore formalize certain arrangements to ensure continuity of care should circumstances change. Specifically, the court recommends that the guardianship documents include provisions for the role of Miss Caroline Thorne in the children's education and welfare, and that consideration be given to the long-term stability of the household arrangement. It is the further opinion of this court that society benefits when unconventional arrangements are based on genuine commitment rather than convenience, and that Mr. Whitmore's guardianship represents the former. This decision is not without precedent, though it may be without precedent in this particular community. Judge Brennan had signed his name with a flourish, and beneath his signature was a handwritten note. "Mr. Whitmore, I believed you. See that you prove me right." Marcus sat in his study for a full hour after reading the decision, processing the significance of what had just occurred. He'd won. Not just the immediate case, but something larger. A judge had looked at his unconventional household and declared it valid. More than valid, he'd called it exceptional. When he finally emerged from the study, he found Sarah, Emma, and Caroline waiting anxiously in the parlor. They'd been watching for the messenger, had seen him arrive, and had been unable to contain themselves. One look at Marcus's face answered their question. Sarah's expression transformed, relief and joy competing with the composed maturity she'd developed. Emma simply began to cry, soundless tears that seemed to release months of accumulated tension. "We're staying?" she asked, her voice small. "We're staying," Marcus confirmed, kneeling down to their eye level. "All of us. Together." Caroline excused herself to give them space, but Marcus stopped her. "This affects you too. The judge mentioned ensuring your role is formalized. I want to make that official not just as their educator, but as a permanent part of this household. I want to ensure your position is secure, regardless of what circumstances change." Caroline looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Whitmore?" "A partnership," Marcus said. "Permanent. Financial security. Your own space. Recognition in the household documents. Whatever arrangement would allow you to commit to this long term without worry about your future." "I see," Caroline said, and something in her tone suggested she'd been considering this possibility. "Let me think about what that means practically. It's a significant commitment on both our parts." Over the following days, word of the judge's decision spread through Millbrook with the inevitability of gossip. The Dust community's reaction was surprisingly mixed. Eleanor Hartwell and her circle remained skeptical, but a substantial portion of the town seemed to accept the judge's validation as permission to reconsider their own judgments. Several women who'd previously avoided social interaction with Marcus made a point of greeting him in town. The general store owner's wife began speaking to Caroline as though she were a respected professional rather than a scandal. More surprisingly, Mrs. Ashford herself sent a letter. It was brief and surprisingly gracious, acknowledging that the judge's decision was legally sound and expressing her hope that the girls would flourish under Marcus's guardianship. She enclosed a package books that had belonged to Margaret, items from Margaret's early life that she thought Sarah and Emma might treasure. The letter ended with an unexpected offer. Mrs. Ashford wanted to maintain contact with the girls, to serve as a connection to their mother's memory. She suggested quarterly correspondence and offered to fund any additional educational materials they might require. It was a profound change from her adversarial stance during the hearing, and Marcus found himself reassessing his judgment of her. She'd lost her cousin and had simply wanted to ensure the girls were cared for. That her methods had been confrontational didn't necessarily negate her genuine concern. But the most significant development came from Cedar Falls, the community that Margaret had been traveling to serve. The superintendent of the Cedar Falls Education Board arrived at the ranch in mid-February, a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell, no relation to Eleanor, though the name similarity was amusing given Eleanor's involvement in the scandal. Elizabeth was approximately Caroline's age, educated, progressive in her thinking about women's education, and impressed by what she found at the ranch. She spent 3 days observing Caroline's lessons, examining the girls' work, and discussing educational philosophy with both Caroline and Marcus. On her final evening, she made a proposal that would alter the trajectory of their household once again. "Your educational environment here is exceptional," Elizabeth said, sitting in the parlor after the girls had been put to bed. "Caroline's pedagogy is sophisticated. The girls' progress is remarkable. And you've created something that most formal schools can't achieve, genuine intellectual engagement combined with emotional safety." "Thank you," Caroline said, "though I'm not certain where this observation is leading." "Cedar Falls would like to partner with you," Elizabeth said directly. "We have 18 children in the settlement, ranging from ages 6 to 16. We have no school building, no permanent teacher. What we have is a community that values education and the resources to support it. What we need is someone to establish a formal school. I came here wondering if Caroline might be interested in relocating. But having seen what you've created, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in expanding rather than relocating." Marcus felt something shift in the room. This was an opportunity and a threat simultaneously. Opportunity for the girls to have broader educational community, for Caroline to have the kind of professional platform her skills deserved. But threat because it meant change, expansion, a departure from the privacy they'd carefully maintained. "Explain," Caroline said, her tone carefully neutral. "You maintain your household as it is," Elizabeth continued, "but you formalize a satellite school operation. 2 days a week, perhaps, the Cedar Falls children come here for instruction. Or you could establish a separate school building on the ranch property, supported by Cedar Falls funding. It would legitimize what you're already doing, transform it from a private household arrangement into a recognized educational institution, thereby eliminating the scandal aspects," Marcus said, understanding the deeper implications. "Exactly," Elizabeth agreed. "The moment you're running an accredited school, your household structure becomes professionally justified rather than socially questionable. Society is remarkably willing to accept unconventional arrangements if they're clothed in institutional legitimacy." It was a calculated observation, and Marcus respected Elizabeth for making it explicit. But it also raised questions about motivation. Would they be building a school because it was the right thing to do, or because it conveniently resolved social complications? "I need to think about this," Caroline said. "It's not just my decision. It affects Mr. Whitmore and the girls, and it affects the community of Cedar Falls as well. I won't commit to something I haven't fully considered." Elizabeth left her contact information and departed the following morning. After she was gone, Marcus and Caroline found themselves engaged in the kind of extended conversation that had become increasingly common between them. "Do you want to do it?" Marcus asked. "Want to isn't the right question," Caroline said, setting down her teacup. "The question is whether it's the right thing to do. Expanding the school would provide education to 18 children who otherwise might not receive it. It would create institutional legitimacy for our arrangement, but it would also fundamentally transform the household from a family into a quasi-public institution. I'm not certain that's desirable." "What would make you certain?" Marcus asked. Caroline looked at him directly. "Understanding the actual reason you want to do it, and understanding my own reason for either accepting or refusing." It was a moment that hung between them, a moment that contained possibilities neither had explicitly acknowledged. Marcus found himself suddenly aware of Caroline, not as a hired educator or a solution to a practical problem, but as a woman who'd been present through the most significant transformation of his adult life, who understood the girls as completely as he did, who'd chosen to stay despite the social complications. "I want to do it," he said carefully, "because it would honor Margaret's original plan, because it would provide opportunities for other children, and because it would give legitimacy to something I believe in deeply. But I also want to do it because I want to understand whether this household can exist as something more than a practical arrangement. Whether what we've built here could be sustainable long-term, not just because it's convenient, but because it's genuinely what we choose." Caroline set down her cup with deliberate precision. "That's a significant statement." "I'm aware," Marcus said quietly. "I need time," Caroline said, standing. "This decision requires more careful consideration than a conversation in the parlor. Let me think, Mr. Whitmore. Let me consider what I actually want versus what I think I should want." Over. The following weeks, the ranch settled into a holding pattern. Marcus made no further progress on the Cedar Falls proposal, though he did begin making preliminary arrangements, surveying land for a potential school building, consulting with architects about design. Sarah and Emma seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of uncertainty between Marcus and Caroline, though Marcus suspected Sarah, with her unusual perceptiveness, sensed something was changing. It was Dorothy who finally provided clarity. She cornered Marcus one afternoon while he was reviewing accounts. "You're going to have to decide what you actually want," Dorothy said bluntly, in the manner of someone who'd known Marcus long enough to ignore conventional social filters. "Because Miss Thorne has already decided. She's just waiting for you to catch up." "Decided what?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew. "That she loves this place, that she loves these girls, and that she loves you, though she's too sensible to admit it until you give her permission to hope it might be reciprocated." Marcus set down his pen. "She told you this?" "She didn't have to," Dorothy said. "I've been managing households for 40 years. I know what love looks like, and I know what fear looks like. Miss Thorne has love. She's afraid you'll make her feel foolish for it." "I would never." "Intentions don't matter," Dorothy interrupted. "Action matters. You need to decide whether this household is just about the girls or whether it's about building something larger. And then you need to have an actual conversation with Miss Thorne instead of circling around it like two cattle herd at a waterhole." That evening, Marcus found Caroline in the library, where she was organizing new books that had arrived from Helena. He closed the door behind him, a gesture that made her look up with sudden attention. "The Cedar Falls proposal," he said without preamble. "I want to do it, but not for the reasons that would make sense professionally. I want to do it because it would change how the community perceives this household. It would provide institutional legitimacy. But more than that, I want to do it because it would formalize something that's already happening. The way you've become essential to Sarah and Emma. The way this household has become dependent on your presence. The way I've become—" He stopped, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to contain what he was trying to express. "Dependent on my presence," Caroline offered, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood exactly what he was attempting to articulate. "Yes," Marcus said. "I came into my study 3 days ago to find you'd reorganized it. You've never done that before. I realized it was because you felt comfortable enough to do something that changed my space without asking permission first. That suggests a level of certainty about your place here that goes beyond employment." "It does," Caroline said quietly. "Though I've been trying to be careful about implying too much based on a practical arrangement." "It's not practical anymore," Marcus said, "if it ever was. What you've become to this household, to Sarah and Emma, to me that's not practical. That's essential." Caroline set down the book she'd been holding. "I need to be clear about something, Mr. Whitmore. If we're about to have a conversation that's as significant as this moment suggests, we need to establish some basic honesty. I'm not staying because you're a kind man who rescued 2 girls. I'm not staying because it's a professional opportunity. I'm staying because I've come to believe this is where I belong, and because I've developed feelings that exceed what professional propriety permits me to express." Marcus moved toward her. "Then perhaps we should stop maintaining professional propriety." "That's easier said than done in a community that's already skeptical of our arrangement," Caroline said. "If we formalize anything beyond educational partnership, if we acknowledge that there's romantic attachment between us, we reintroduce all the scandal we've tried to neutralize." "Unless we marry," Marcus said, the words emerging with sudden clarity. "If we marry, the arrangement becomes not a scandal, but a triumph. A man and woman who built something meaningful together, who created a household designed around intellectual and emotional growth rather than convention. That's not scandal, that's a story of redemption and purpose." Caroline laughed, a sound of genuine surprise. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Whitmore?" "Because it's the most unusual I've ever heard, and I've read quite extensively. It's an observation that I've spent the month since finding those girls in the wagon learning how to hope again," Marcus said. "Not romantic love, not immediately anyway, though I won't rule it out as a possibility, but genuine partnership, shared purpose, commitment to something larger than either of us alone. That's what you've represented to me since the day you arrived. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to formalize that commitment in a way that would satisfy social convention while honoring what's actually happening between us. I need to think about that, Caroline said, but there was a smile in her voice, which I realize has become my standard response to significant questions. But this one deserves genuine consideration. Take the time you need, Marcus said, but know that I'm not asking out of convenience or social necessity. I'm asking because the alternative, continuing to pretend this is merely a practical arrangement, has become impossible. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and acknowledgement. Caroline turned back to her books, but her hands were trembling slightly. And Marcus, returning to his study, found himself thinking not about the legal implications or the social ramifications, but about the possibility of building a life with someone who understood exactly what he was trying to create. Not just a family, but a vision of what family could be when built on choice rather than obligation. 2 weeks passed without any direct discussion between Marcus and Caroline about his proposal. Instead, they continued their daily routines with a new awareness underlying every interaction. Caroline was thoughtful when she looked at him, her eyes suggesting internal deliberation. Marcus found himself watching her not obsessively, but with heightened attention to her movements, her preferences, her particular way of laughing at something Sarah said during lessons. It was Emma who finally broke the silence. She approached Marcus one afternoon while he was working on fence repairs and asked with characteristic directness, "Are you going to marry Miss Caroline?" Marcus set down his tools, unsure whether to be amused or concerned at the child's perceptiveness. "What makes you ask that?" "Because she looks at you the way Mama used to look at her." "Books," Emma said, "like you contain something important, and you look at her like you're trying to remember something. That's how married people look at each other." "Is that so?" Marcus said, wondering what other insights Emma had accumulated. Also, Dorothy mentioned it to Henry, and Henry mentioned it to the other ranch hands, Emma said matter-of-factly. "So the whole household probably knows except Miss Caroline, who pretends not to notice things that are obvious." The conversation gave Marcus permission to stop waiting for a formal response. That evening he found Caroline in the sitting room, grading essays with the kind of focused attention she brought to all her work. He sat down across from her without preamble. "I don't need more time," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said about formality satisfying social convention while honoring what's actually happening. And I've realized that I want both. The institutional legitimacy that Cedar Falls offers, certainly, but also the personal commitment. I want to marry you, Caroline. Not because society requires it, but because I believe it's the right choice for both of us." Caroline set down her pen and looked at him directly. "I've been thinking too," she said, "about what marriage would mean in this context, about how it would change the household dynamics, about what it would signify to Sarah and Emma, about whether I'm prepared for that level of commitment." She paused, and Marcus felt suspended between hope and resignation. "And I've concluded," Caroline continued, "that this arrangement makes sense on every level, emotionally, intellectually, and practically. I want to marry you as well. Though I have conditions." "Conditions?" Marcus asked, surprised. "I want the marriage to be a genuine partnership," Caroline said. "Equal decision-making authority regarding the girl's upbringing, equal say in household matters, financial security that isn't dependent on your benevolence. I want my own income and resources. And I want the school to be genuinely collaborative, not something you fund while I implement your vision, but something we build together." "All of that seems entirely reasonable," Marcus said. "What else?" "Nothing else," Caroline said with a slight smile. "Those are the conditions. If you can agree to those, then yes, I will marry you." They didn't embrace or engage in the romantic gestures typically associated with engagements. Instead, they sat across from each other in quiet understanding, two people who'd arrived at a significant life decision through intellectual and emotional alignment rather than emotional explosion. The announcement of their engagement created a surprisingly muted scandal. The community had been primed by Eleanor Hartwell and her circle to expect something scandalous, but instead they received news of a formal engagement between two respectable, educated individuals who were already living respectably together. The anticipated moral outrage seemed deflated by the sheer practicality of the arrangement. More surprisingly, Eleanor herself called on Caroline, apparently to offer congratulations, but actually to engage in what became an unexpectedly genuine conversation. Eleanor, it transpired, had never married. Her husband had died 30 years earlier, and she'd spent her widowhood managing their estate and her considerable social influence. She'd assumed that Caroline was attempting to trap Marcus into matrimony, but meeting Caroline directly and seeing her competence and intelligence, Eleanor underwent a reassessment. "I misjudged you," Eleanor said bluntly, which was apparently Eleanor's style when genuine conversation occurred. "I saw what I expected to see, rather than what was actually present. I apologize for my interference." "Your concern for the girl's welfare was legitimate," Caroline said, showing more grace than Eleanor deserved. "Even if your proposed solution was misguided, I don't hold your initial skepticism against you." Eleanor's social circle, having received tacit permission from their leader to reconsider their judgment, began integrating Marcus and Caroline into Millbrook's social events. Invitations arrived for dinners and church functions. Women began calling on Caroline to discuss her educational methods, apparently believing that becoming engaged to a respectable rancher had suddenly made her opinions worth hearing. The wedding itself was scheduled for late spring, a modest ceremony that reflected both Marcus's and Caroline's preference for substance over pageantry. Dr. Prescott agreed to travel from Helena to serve as Caroline's stand-in father. Mrs. Ashford would attend from Helena. The ranch hands were invited, as were the townspeople who'd supported the guardianship case. But before the wedding could occur, the question of the school demanded resolution. Elizabeth Hartwell from Cedar Falls sent increasingly detailed proposals about how a satellite educational operation could function. She suggested a formal partnership wherein the ranch would host a school 2 days per week for Cedar Falls students, with Marcus and Caroline receiving compensation for both the instruction and the use of facilities. "It's actually quite clever," Caroline said, reviewing the financial proposal. "It would provide the legitimacy we need, but also actual income beyond what's required for basic operations. We could expand the library, purchase better scientific equipment, create a genuinely comprehensive educational environment." "Do you want to do it?" Marcus asked, testing whether Caroline's agreement to marry him had created assumptions about shared decision-making. "I'm asking whether you want to do it," Caroline countered. "You're the one who would be funding most of it until the school reaches financial stability. Your business would be affected. Your time would be more constrained." "I want to do it," Marcus said. "I came to that conclusion after Elizabeth left. This household was built around Margaret's dream of creating educational opportunity. Building the school honors that dream, and it provides a larger purpose for what we've already created." They contacted Elizabeth within the week to formally accept her proposal. The next 3 months were consumed with logistics. Architects were commissioned to design a schoolhouse that would operate as a separate building on the ranch property, but remain close to the main house for shared meals and resources. A curriculum was developed that would serve students ranging from 6 to 16 years old in various subjects. Supplies were ordered, equipment was purchased, and the property was surveyed and prepared. Sarah and Emma, watching this transformation, began to understand that the household they lived in was becoming something larger than itself. Sarah asked if she could help teach the younger Cedar Falls students. Emma asked if she could create illustrations for educational materials. "You can both help," Marcus said, consulting with Caroline before confirming. though your primary responsibility remains your own education. We're creating opportunities for others, but not at the expense of your own development." The week before the wedding, as final preparations were being made, Sarah approached Marcus in his study. She'd grown taller in the months since he'd found her at the wagon, but she still moved with a careful guardedness, as though expecting the world to shift without warning. "I wanted to tell you something," Sarah said, "before you marry Miss Caroline. I wanted you to know that I'm glad we didn't go with Mrs. Ashford." Marcus set down the document he'd been reviewing. "Are you? Even though it would have been conventional and proper?" "Especially because it would have been that," Sarah said. "Mama used to say that safety and conventional were sometimes the same thing, but not always. Sometimes what felt safest was actually what limited you most. Mrs. Ashford's household would have been safe. But this household with you and Miss Caroline is the kind of place where we actually become who we're meant to be." "That's a remarkable insight," Marcus said. "Miss Caroline taught me that," Sarah said simply, "that education isn't just about learning facts, it's about learning how to think about the world in ways that expand rather than constrain. You two are teaching that to me and Emma every day, not just in lessons but in how you've built this entire life." After Sarah left, Marcus sat in the growing darkness of his study, understanding that he'd been given something unexpected. Not just the satisfaction of building something meaningful, but the recognition from a child who'd lost everything that he'd helped create a space where she could truly flourish. The wedding took place on a warm afternoon in May, in the ranch's main drawing room, decorated simply with wildflowers that Sarah and Emma had spent all morning gathering. There were, perhaps, 50 guests, townspeople who'd come to support them, family connections who'd traveled considerable distances, and the ranch staff who'd become integral to the household's functioning. Judge Brennan officiated, apparently having decided that his professional involvement in their guardianship case extended to witnessing their marriage. He performed the ceremony with evident satisfaction, delivering vows that emphasized partnership and shared purpose rather than romantic sentiment. "Do you, Marcus, take Caroline to be your wife, committing to partnership in all matters concerning your household and the care of your children and your community?" "I do," Marcus said, and meant it with a clarity that came from months of deliberate decision-making. "And do you, Caroline, take Marcus to be your husband, committing to equal partnership in the building of this life and this household?" "I do," Caroline said, and when she looked at Marcus, there was warmth in her eyes that suggested her answer encompassed far more than legal commitment. They exchanged rings, simple bands of gold without ornamentation, and then Judge Brennan pronounced them married. The community applauded, but it was the reaction of Sarah and Emma that mattered most. Both girls were crying, not from sadness, but from the kind of overwhelming emotion that comes from witnessing something significant finally solidifying into permanence. The celebration that followed was modest, but genuine. The ranch hands had prepared a substantial meal. Music was provided by several guests who had instruments. The evening extended long into darkness, with people lingering to offer congratulations and to witness what had become, in the community's mind, a remarkable love story. But for Marcus and Caroline, the significance of the day was not romantic, but structural. They had formalized a partnership that was already functioning effectively. They had given the community a narrative that made sense of their arrangement, and they had created legal structures that ensured continuity of care for Sarah and Emma, regardless of what circumstances might change in the future. The following week, the schoolhouse was completed. It was a modest but well-constructed building with large windows, desks arranged to accommodate both individual and group instruction, and shelves ready to be filled with books. On the first day of operation, 18 children from Cedar Falls arrived in wagons, accompanied by their parents who were curious about this educational experiment that had developed in such an unconventional setting. Sarah and Emma attended classes alongside the other students, which created an interesting dynamic. They were already advanced in their studies, But rather than making them feel superior, Caroline structured lessons to ensure everyone could contribute meaningfully, regardless of their level. The older students became peer teachers for the younger ones. The younger students asked questions that challenged the older ones to think more deeply about what they'd already learned. By the end of the first week, the parents from Cedar Falls were impressed enough to request that the school expand to 3 days per week. Elizabeth Hartwell began exploring the possibility of making the arrangement permanent, perhaps eventually establishing a formal academy that would serve as a regional educational hub. One evening, as Marcus and Caroline were reviewing the school's first-week records, Caroline looked at him with something that might have been amazement. "Do you realize what we've created?" she asked. "We started with 2 orphaned girls and a rancher who'd given up on life. Now we're running an educational institution that's transforming how an entire region approaches children's learning. We started," Marcus corrected gently, "with a decision to honor Margaret's memory by giving her daughters a chance at meaningful lives. Everything else followed from that single choice to treat them as valuable rather than as problems to be solved." "That's it exactly," Caroline said. "That's the actual innovation here. Not the educational methods or the curriculum design, but the radical belief that all children deserve to have their potential developed, regardless of their circumstances. Margaret understood that. You understood it when you found those girls at the wagon. And together, we've built something that makes that belief tangible." Marcus reached across the desk and took her hand. It was a gesture he'd never have made before, but marriage had given him permission to express affection physically as well as through action. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Caroline asked. "For seeing what this could become when I was still convinced it was just an emergency response to a tragedy." Caroline smiled. "Thank you for having the courage to build something unconventional when society was demanding you conform. That's the actual gift." As they sat in the growing darkness of the study, watching the schoolhouse in the distance lit by lamps where evening lessons were still in progress, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Not the restlessness that had characterized his adult life since Rebecca's death, but a sense of completion, of purpose realized. Of a life that, while beginning in tragedy, had transformed into something transcendent. The path from that moment at the overturned wagon to this one had been neither simple nor direct, but every step had been necessary. Every decision had mattered, and every challenge had ultimately expanded rather than constrained his understanding of what was possible when love was expressed through commitment to something larger than oneself. The autumn wind swept across the Montana grasslands exactly as it had 5 years earlier, but the landscape had transformed in subtle and profound ways. The Whitmore Ranch now included a fully operational school building that had expanded twice to accommodate growing enrollment. What had begun as an experiment serving 18 Cedar Falls students had evolved into a regional institution with nearly 70 students attending classes ranging from basic literacy instruction for younger children to advanced natural science for teenagers preparing for university education. Sarah stood in the new library that Marcus and Caroline had constructed adjacent to the school building, shelving books with the methodical care of someone who'd learned to value knowledge as a tangible thing. She was 14 now, tall and composed, with an intensity in her eyes that suggested she was always thinking about something larger than the immediate moment. Her dark hair was pinned up in a simple style, and she wore a practical dress appropriate for work rather than society. Emma, 12 and significantly shorter than her twin, was at the far end of the library, creating detailed botanical illustrations for a new educational series on native plants. She'd developed considerable artistic skill, and her drawings were being used not just in the school, but reproduced and distributed to other educational institutions across Montana and beyond. A publisher in Denver had recently approached about compiling her illustrations into a comprehensive guide to frontier flora. "Sarah," Emma called, not looking up from her work, "do you think we would have ended up here if we hadn't lost Mama?" It was the kind of question Emma asked periodically, philosophical, unanswerable, but necessary for her processing of a loss that had fundamentally shaped their lives. "No," Sarah said, moving to sit beside her sister. "We would have ended up somewhere in Mama's school in Cedar Falls. We would have been educated well, probably, but we would have been students in someone else's vision. Here, we're partners in building something that has Mama's fingerprints all over it. But that's also our own." The school day was ending. Students filed out of the main schoolhouse in Day Spy. Clusters, some heading to town in wagons, others walking toward the ranch where they boarded during the school week. The students represented a cross-section of frontier life, children of ranchers, farmers, miners, merchants, and several whose families were in more precarious circumstances. Caroline and Marcus had established a scholarship system that ensured economic circumstances didn't determine educational opportunity, a philosophy that Margaret Chen had pioneered and that her daughters were ensuring continued. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the library, still dressed in work clothes despite the evening hour. He'd aged in the 5 years since finding Sarah and Emma. There was more grey in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but he moved with a lightness that had been absent in those early days of grief. "The Hendersons are coming for dinner," he said. "Their daughter has been accepted to university in San Francisco. They want to discuss financial arrangements for her." "Continued education. Which university?" Sarah asked immediately. "Berkeley," Marcus said. "She wants to study medicine." Apparently that's become quite feasible since several women have successfully completed medical education there. Sarah's expression shifted from academic interest to something more personal. "I want to go to university," she said. "I haven't mentioned it because it seemed impractical, but Berkeley is actually close to where Cedar Falls was trying to send Mama to study education theory. I could go there, study education and natural science, and come back here to help us run the school," Caroline finished, appearing behind Marcus. "We've been expecting you to articulate that plan for at least 6 months. We assumed you'd figure it out eventually." Sarah looked between Caroline and Marcus, searching their faces for any sign of the resistance she might have anticipated. Finding none, she felt something settle in her chest, the recognition that she was being treated as a full participant in the family's long-term planning, rather than as a dependent child whose future could be decided for her. "You're not going to try to convince me to get married and settle down instead?" Sarah asked, only partially joking. "Absolutely not," Caroline said. "Education and personal development come before marriage. If you happen to meet someone along the way who shares your values and your commitment to learning, that's a bonus. But you're going to Berkeley to become the educator you're meant to be, not to find a husband," Marcus added. "Your mother would have wanted exactly this. She spent her entire life creating opportunities for others to learn. The greatest honor we can give her memory is ensuring that her daughters carry that work forward." That evening, the Hendersons arrived for dinner. They were a merchant family from Cedar Falls, people of modest means who'd sacrificed significantly to support their daughter's education. They were surprised, but deeply moved to learn that Marcus and Caroline would cover the majority of Eleanor Henderson's university expenses in exchange for her commitment to return to the region and teach for at least 5 years after completing her medical education. "We're investing in you," Marcus explained, "because we believe in the principle that education creates obligation to serve the community that enabled it. Eleanor will be an exceptional physician. The frontier needs physicians. Therefore, we fund her education with the expectation that she'll use her skills to serve." It was a model that had developed organically from the school's operation. Students who showed exceptional promise but lacked resources received educational funding with the understanding that they would return to work in the community or in similarly underserved regions. The system was imperfect. Some students did leave and never return, moving to urban centers where opportunities were greater. But most honored the implicit contract. understanding that their education had been possible only because someone believed in them enough to invest. After the Hendersons left, satisfied and hopeful about their daughter's future, the household settled into evening routine. Emma was finishing her botanical illustrations for the evening. Sarah was reading an advanced text on pedagogical theory. Caroline was preparing lesson plans for the next week's classes. And Marcus was reviewing accounts the school had become financially sustainable, but barely, requiring careful management to ensure they could continue expanding educational opportunity. It was a domestic scene that would have seemed ordinary to most observers, but for Marcus, it represented the completion of a journey that had begun in grief and despair. He thought back to the man he'd been before, finding Sarah and Emma successful by conventional measures, but hollow, his grief having transformed him into someone who managed life rather than living it. "Caroline," he said, looking up from the accounts, "do you ever regret it? Choosing this life instead of pursuing a conventional academic position?" Caroline looked up from her lesson plans. "Do you regret finding those girls at the wagon? Because that's the same question. Do you regret the choice that led to everything that's happened since?" "Not for a moment," Marcus said immediately. "Then neither do I," Caroline replied. "Regret only exists if you believe the choice was wrong. I believe this choice was right. Everything that's followed has confirmed that belief. And every student who's learned to think critically, every family that's had access to education they couldn't afford elsewhere, every child who's discovered their potential, all of that validates the decision to build this institution." Over the following months, preparations began for Sarah's departure to Berkeley. She would leave in late summer, traveling by train with a letter of introduction from Caroline to the Dean of Women's Studies, and financial support that would cover tuition and most living expenses. Emma, who would remain behind, was both happy for her sister and struggling with the prospect of separation. "We've never been apart," Emma said to Marcus one afternoon while they were working on repairs to the school building's exterior. "No," Marcus agreed, "but you're both becoming people who can exist independently. That was always the goal, not to keep you dependent on each other or on this household, but to develop you into individuals capable of building your own meaningful lives." "I'm going to miss her terribly," Emma said. "You will," Marcus said. "And that's as it should be. Missing someone you love is the price of loving them. It means they matter to you. But missing her won't prevent either of you from becoming who you're meant to be." The day Sarah departed, the entire household went to the station in Millbrook to see her off. Judge Brennan came to say goodbye. Eleanor Hartwell, now a genuine friend rather than a skeptical observer, brought Emma a small painting she'd commissioned as a gift. Dr. Morrison arrived on horseback despite his advancing age, bringing medical supplies for Sarah to take with her and extracting a promise that she would study medicine alongside her education theory if the opportunity arose. Standing on the station platform, Sarah hugged each of them. Marcus, Caroline, Emma, Dorothy, Henry, all the people who'd become her family through circumstance and choice rather than biology. When she hugged Emma, they both cried, but neither tried to convince the other to abandon their path. "You're going to come back and teach with us," Emma said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I'm going to come back and build on what we've started," Sarah corrected gently. "Whether that's teaching in the school or something larger, I don't know yet. But whatever I become, it will be because this household gave me the foundation to imagine becoming anything at all." The train pulled away from the station, carrying Sarah toward a future she'd never have accessed without the convergence of a tragic accident, a man's impulsive kindness, and a woman's educational vision. The group stood in silence as the train disappeared into the distance, each of them contemplating what this household would become, with one of its twin pillars temporarily removed. That autumn and winter, the rhythm of the household adjusted. Emma threw herself into her botanical work with intensified focus, creating illustrated books that were being distributed to schools across 3 states. She also began teaching art to the younger students, discovering that she had a gift for instruction that paralleled her artistic ability. Caroline noticed the change and began slowly mentoring Emma toward a more formal teaching role. "You're developing as an educator," Caroline told her one afternoon. "Your artistic skill is remarkable, but your ability to help others see the world through visual observation, that's your real gift. Have you considered that teaching might be as much your path as it was your sister's?" "I thought my path was supposed to be different from Sarah's," Emma said. "That we were developing separately." "You are," Caroline agreed. "But your paths don't have to be opposite to be distinct. Sarah is developing as a theoretical educator who will probably work at the university level eventually. You're developing as a practitioner educator who helps people learn through observation and artistic practice. Both paths are valid, both serve important purposes." By spring, Marcus made a significant decision. He began transferring operational responsibility for the ranch itself to Henry and 2 other trusted employees, gradually moving out of day-to-day ranch management. His primary focus became the school, not as an emergency response to personal tragedy, but as a deliberate investment in institutional growth. "I want to expand," he told Caroline. "Not just adding more students to the existing structure, but considering whether this model could work in other locations. Whether we could establish satellite schools in other frontier communities, creating a network of educational opportunity." "That's ambitious," Caroline said. "It would require traveling, establishing partnerships with other communities, identifying educators capable of managing similar programs." "It would also require your partnership," Marcus said. "I can't build this alone. I don't want to build it alone." Caroline considered this seriously. It would mean leaving the school periodically. It would mean complexity and uncertainty. But it would also mean living fully into the vision that Margaret started, not just educating 2 orphaned girls, but transforming educational opportunity across entire regions. "Exactly," Marcus said. Over the following year, Marcus and Caroline began what would become a multi-year project. They traveled to communities across Montana and beyond, meeting with local leaders, assessing educational needs, identifying potential partners who shared their vision. Wherever they went, they brought documentation of what they'd built at the ranch: student work, educational outcomes, community testimonials. Emma, though only 13, was left in charge of the Whitmore School during their absences, with Henry managing the ranch operations and Dorothy overseeing household management. It was an extraordinary amount of responsibility for a child, but Emma rose to meet it. She organized lessons, managed teacher coordination, ensured students were cared for, and the facility was maintained. When Sarah returned from Berkeley for her first extended visit, having completed her first year of education study with extraordinary academic standing, she found her sister transformed. Emma had matured in a way that went beyond the physical changes of adolescence. She developed leadership capacity, decision-making confidence, and an understanding of what it meant to carry responsibility for others' learning and growth. "You've become a woman," Sarah said, looking at her sister with genuine surprise. "I had to," Emma replied simply. "Someone needed to hold things together while Marcus and Caroline were traveling, building the network of schools. And I wanted to prove that I could contribute something meaningful beyond creating pretty pictures." "The botanical illustrations are meaningful," Sarah said firmly. "But you're right that you're becoming something more. You're becoming an administrator, an educator, a leader. That's extraordinary development in a single year." That summer, when Marcus and Caroline returned from their travels, they brought news that transformed the household's trajectory once again. They'd partnered with 3 communities to establish satellite schools following the Whitmore model. Educators had been identified and trained. Funding had been secured. The first classes would begin in the fall. "This is actually happening," Marcus said that evening, gathering the household around the dinner table to share the news. "What we imagined as a possibility 5 years ago is becoming a concrete institution. We're not just educating children in our immediate community anymore. We're creating a model that other communities can replicate. And you're going to need leadership, Caroline added, looking at both Emma and Sarah. We need people to help manage the growing complexity. Sarah, when you finish your education degree, we want you to consider coming back as a full partner in developing the school's curriculum and training new educators. Emma, we want you to eventually oversee the satellite school's operations, ensuring they maintain the standards and philosophy we've established. You're asking us to build on what Mama started, Emma said, understanding the deeper significance of the proposal. We're asking you to become the educators you're resizé. Mother hoped you would be, Marcus corrected gently. But not in the way she might have imagined. You're going to help transform educational opportunity across an entire region. That's a legacy that honors her memory far more than anything we could have planned in those early days. The conversation continued long into the evening, discussing logistics, possibilities, challenges, but beneath the practical planning was a deeper recognition. What had begun as a personal tragedy, 2 orphaned girls, and a man who'd lost the capacity to hope, had transformed into something institutional, something that would outlast any individual, and would serve generations of children yet to be born. 5 years after finding Sarah and Emma at an overturned wagon, Marcus Whitmore understood that salvation had worked both ways. He'd saved them from orphanage and abandonment, but they had saved him from a life of mere existence, from grief that had become indistinguishable from stagnation. Together, they'd created something that transcended personal rescue and became public service. That autumn, as the new school year began, and Marcus looked out at the expanded schoolhouse, filled with children learning to read, to think, to imagine futures beyond their current circumstances, he thought about the moment he'd knelt down beside that overturned wagon and made a choice. He'd said to those terrified girls, "I'm not taking you, I'm joining you." And in joining them, in committing to their welfare and their potential, he'd found the redemption he'd stopped believing was possible. He'd found a reason to live fully rather than merely survive. He'd found purpose that encompassed more than personal success or accumulation of wealth. Most importantly, he'd learned that the greatest gift one person could give another wasn't rescue from tragedy, but belief in their capacity to become something meaningful despite it. Margaret Chen had understood that. She'd spent her life carrying books across a dangerous landscape, believing that education could transform circumstances. Her death had seemed to end that mission, but her daughters carried it forward. The man who'd found them at a wagon had understood its importance and built an institution around it. And in doing so, he'd created something that would outlast grief, outlast convention, outlast the individual choices that had sparked it all. He'd created legacy, not through blood relation or inheritance, but through commitment to a vision larger than himself. That was the actual story, not of a wealthy rancher rescuing 2 orphaned girls, but of 3 broken people finding wholeness through dedication to something beyond their individual survival. The final pieces of Marcus's understanding came on a winter evening, years later, when he was old, and Sarah was directing her own university program in education, and Emma had established 3 additional schools across the frontier. Emma asked him a question that brought everything full circle. "Do you remember," Emma asked, "exactly why you decided to keep us? What made you stay at that wagon instead of just reporting the accident?" Marcus thought back to that autumn day, the wind, the overturned wagon, the 2 terrified faces peering from the darkness. He tried to isolate the moment when his decision had crystallized. "I think," he said slowly, "it was because I understood in that moment that you needed more than rescue. You needed someone to believe that your lives mattered, that your potential was worth protecting, that your mother's dream of educating you was worth continuing even after her death. I couldn't give you back what you'd lost, but I could give you something that made the loss survivable, a community, an institution, a commitment to the future you deserved to have. You gave us that," Emma said, And in giving it to us, you gave it to thousands of children we've educated since. That's the actual legacy, isn't it? Not the individual rescue, but the expansion of rescue into systematic opportunity. Yes, Marcus said, finally understanding completely. That's exactly what it is. And so the story that began at an overturned wagon that nearly ended in orphanage and despair became instead the foundation for an institution that would serve generations. Not because one man was exceptionally noble, but because he made a choice to join the suffering rather than merely manage it. And in joining, he transformed both the children he rescued and himself, creating meaning from tragedy and hope from loss. That was the real miracle, not the rescue itself, but what the rescue became when it was built upon, expanded upon, and passed forward to others. This story reminds us that the greatest acts of kindness are often not the dramatic rescues, but the quiet commitments we make to building something larger than ourselves. Marcus found two lost girls and chose to join their journey rather than simply save them. In doing so, he discovered that salvation is mutual, that we heal others by allowing ourselves to be healed through service to something greater than our own grief. Margaret's library survived and became the foundation of education for thousands. Sarah and Emma became the educators their mother had hoped they would be, multiplying her impact far beyond what she could have accomplished alone. And Marcus, who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his wife, discovered that love takes many forms and that the deepest love is often expressed through commitment to others' growth and potential. That is the true meaning of being family. Not blood, not convention, but choice. The daily, deliberate choice to show up, to invest, to believe in possibilities, even when circumstances suggest hopelessness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.